Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal that afternoon, the Quartermain estate seemed to exhale a rare kind of serenity, one not often found within its storied walls. Golden sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, casting long, delicate beams that danced over the antique furnishings and polished hardwood floors. A warm glow blanketed the drawing room, where laughter rang out, the pure, unfiltered joy of children that seemed to wash away the heaviness of past months. Wiley's delighted squeals mingled with Amelia's giggles as they tumbled about on the rug, a picture of innocence that made the heart ache. Cradled between these sweet echoes of childhood, Daisy cooed in Sasha's arms while Michael sat close beside her, his hand resting almost unconsciously on her knee. Their eyes met more than once. Brief, weighted glances that carried years of history, pain, loss, reconciliation, and, above all, a fierce and unrelenting love for the children now within arm's reach. There were no arguments that day. No lawyers, no visitation schedules, no legal posturing or veiled threats. For the first time in a long while, there was only a delicate peace, as fragile as glass, suspended in time. Sasha, with tremendous inner strength, had finally relented on one of the thorniest issues. She would allow Michael to remain part of Daisy's life, but on one condition: his name would not appear on the birth certificate. It was not a slight, not a dismissal, but rather a line drawn in the sand to protect a part of herself that still bore scars. Michael understood this without protest. He didn't need validation on paper to prove his love for Daisy. But he did ask, gently, almost hesitantly, that if anything were ever to happen to Sasha, she put in writing that he would become Daisy's legal guardian. The moment was quiet but profound. Sasha paused, her expression unreadable, and then slowly nodded. That was the beginning of something new, an unspoken truce between two people forever bound by a little girl with Michael's eyes and Sasha's resilience. The spell of calm was suddenly and violently shattered. A piercing, heart-wrenching sob rang out from across the room. Wiley, once so full of delight, had frozen in place, his small body trembling, his cheeks streaked with tears. He bolted toward Michael, throwing himself into his father's arms, unable to speak, only pointing toward the window with terror etched into every line of his face. Michael caught him instantly, holding him tight, while Sasha instinctively pulled Daisy closer to her chest. A chill swept through the room, unnatural and sharp, like a breath of something unseen. Sasha glanced toward the window just in time to see a shadow retreat, quick and soundless, vanishing behind the curtain of ivy that framed the estate's stone walls. After several agonizing moments, Wiley finally managed to whisper in Michael's ear. A name. Just a name, but it was enough to drain the blood from Michael's face. Time seemed to stop. He held his son tighter, protectively, as his mind reeled. The man Wiley had seen was supposed to be gone. Erased. Buried in the past. A ghost of torment they thought had long been exorcised. But somehow, impossibly, he was back. And he wasn't just back, he was watching them. Michael turned to Sasha, his face pale but resolute. He didn't need to say it. She already knew. In that moment, the illusion of safety they had so carefully crafted cracked open to reveal the rot of an old nightmare creeping back to life. The danger was real. Immediate. And closer than ever before. They could no longer pretend. There would be no more shared nights of laughter, no bedtime stories with all three children tucked safely in their arms. That vision had vanished, replaced by urgency and fear. Sasha spoke first, not with panic, but with clarity. If she stayed, they were all at risk. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching. He was waiting. For what, they didn't know, but the implication was enough. Sasha made the hardest decision a mother could make. She would leave. Not forever. Just long enough to divert the threat away from the children. Long enough to give Michael time to regroup, to protect them. She would disappear into the shadows, hidden behind the security network Michael had scrambled to assemble through old contacts, former allies, people who owed him favors buried in blood and loyalty. Michael didn't argue, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had fought so hard to get to this point. A fragile semblance of unity, of family, and now he had to let it go, because the cost of holding on was too high. As the sun dipped low beyond the treetops, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Sasha stood at the threshold of the estate one last time. She did not look back. She couldn't. Instead, she walked quietly down the stone path, a simple travel bag slung over her shoulder, her figure slowly swallowed by the approaching dusk. Inside the house, Daisy slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering beyond her windows. On the pillow beside her rested a soft, worn teddy bear, Sasha's, from when she was a girl. It was a silent vow. A promise. One day, she would return. When it was safe. When it was over. When she could once again rock her daughter to sleep without glancing nervously at the window. From that moment on, something within Michael shifted irrevocably. He was no longer merely the man caught between the fractures of two lives, the father pulled in opposite directions by the weight of Wiley and Daisy, the former lover torn between Sasha's quiet strength and Willow's broken vulnerability, the son of privilege struggling to reconcile duty with desire. That man, the one who hesitated, who second-guessed himself, who allowed guilt and grief to cloud his decisions, was gone. In his place stood someone new. Someone forged in the crucible of fear, sharpened by instinct, and driven by the fierce, primal need to protect. Michael became the sentinel, the immovable foundation upon which the fragile safety of his children now rested. No longer could he afford to live in the gray area between emotional conflict and passive hope. The moment Wiley whispered that name, the name of the ghost who should not have returned, everything else fell away. And yet, the question haunted him, why now? Why come back after all this time, and for what purpose? The answer eluded him, a storm cloud on the horizon with no clear shape. At night, long after the house had quieted, when Amelia's lullabies had faded and Wiley's breathing had settled into a slow rhythm, Michael would find himself staring through the same window that had once framed a specter. There, in the suffocating silence of the Quartermain estate, he would replay every word Wiley had said, every trembling gesture. That name wasn't just a threat. It was a message. A puzzle. And he couldn't stop himself from asking whether Daisy was the key. She was so small, so full of light, with her wide, searching eyes and the way she reached instinctively for both him and Sasha. Her presence was the very embodiment of hope, of renewal after devastation. But perhaps that was exactly what made her dangerous. Maybe it wasn't just because she was Sasha's child. Maybe it wasn't even because she was Michael's. Maybe it was because of what she represented, an alliance, a legacy, or a mistake that someone else refused to forget. Michael knew the kind of enemies he had made, the kind of debts that weren't erased by time. A man like him, born into power, molded by chaos, did not live a life free from shadows. And sometimes, the sins of the past didn't just return. They multiplied. He couldn't let his children become casualties in a war they didn't start. Wiley, with his innocence still intact despite everything, deserved peace. Amelia, too young to understand, still smiled in her sleep without knowing what evil might be lurking just outside their door. And Daisy, his daughter, by blood or by bond, needed him to be more than a father. She needed him to be a fortress. Michael felt it in his bones now. The estate, once a place of tradition and legacy, had transformed into a battleground, and he was the last line of defense. His every step was calculated. His every word was measured. Every security detail reviewed twice. Every routine disrupted, so that no pattern could be exploited. He started watching people the way he once studied corporate mergers, looking for weaknesses, for betrayals waiting to bloom. There was a new clarity in him, one that came only from realizing that nothing, no wealth, no name, no connection, could insulate a father from the pain of losing a child. And the only way to prevent that loss was to stay 10 steps ahead of the danger. Michael stopped attending social gatherings. He stopped answering calls that didn't come from secure lines. He kept the children within arm's reach whenever possible. He even had cameras installed in rooms no one else knew about. The staff were changed. The gates reinforced. But still, no precaution felt enough, because the true threat was still unknown. And until he understood why that man had returned. And more importantly, what he wanted, there would be no rest. And so, night after night, he stood watch. Alone. Silent. With his hand often resting against the cool pane of glass that separated him from the shadows beyond. Gone were the gentle expressions of a man once known for his compassion. In their place was something more steely, more haunted. His eyes no longer revealed fear, but calculation. He was no longer the son trying to live up to his father's name. He had become something else entirely, something Willow might not recognize, something Sasha had feared might be buried inside him all along. He had become the man who would burn the world to keep his children safe. Meanwhile, far from the manicured lawns and fortified walls of the Quartermain estate, Sasha remained tucked away in an undisclosed location, safe, perhaps, but not at peace. The sanctuary Michael had arranged for her was discreet and well guarded, but it could not shield her from the ache that pulsed through her every waking moment, nor the dread that pressed on her chest with every passing hour. The silence that surrounded her wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Time moved slowly, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of her longing, by the phantom weight of Daisy's body that she still swore she could feel in her arms. She had left to protect her child, to buy them time, but in doing so, she had severed a part of herself. And though she knew it was the right choice, the doubt gnawed at her relentlessly. Each phone call from Michael felt like a tightrope stretched over a chasm. She never knew what would be waiting on the other end of the line, a reassuring update or a quiet hint of disaster. His voice steadied her, yes, but it also reminded her of how far away she was from everything that mattered. Each text message made her hands tremble, each vibration of her phone sent her pulse surging, as if it carried the potential to rip open the fragile calm she clung to. And always, underneath it all, there was the dread, the knowledge that her absence was only a diversion, a brief detour in a much darker game. But it was at night, when the world was still and the darkness pressed in close, that Sasha's torment became unbearable. The nightmares came with a consistency that felt deliberate, as if someone, or something, were planting them in her mind. In these dreams, Daisy was always there, small, vulnerable, reaching out with her tiny fingers. Sasha would always be holding her, cradling her close, trying desperately to flee some unseen terror. And without fail, a moment would come when Daisy would be torn from her arms. No matter how tightly Sasha clutched her daughter, some invisible force would rip them apart, and she would watch in horror as Daisy disappeared into the shadows. Michael would be there too, paralyzed, his hands reaching but never touching, his mouth open in a silent scream. And behind it all, always lurking, was the figure, the twisted silhouette of a man with a crooked smile that never reached his eyes, a smile that seemed to promise unspeakable things. Sasha would wake drenched in sweat, her breath ragged, her hands clawing at empty air. She no longer trusted her sleep. Her dreams were too vivid, too consistent. They felt like more than just products of fear, they felt like warnings. Premonitions. And it was that feeling, more than anything, that began to unravel the thin thread of stability she had managed to preserve. She began to wonder whether she had ever truly escaped the threat, or if she had merely given it space to evolve. The feeling of being watched never quite left her. Even in this remote location, surrounded by people whose loyalty Michael had personally vetted, Sasha could not shake the sensation that eyes were following her every movement. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a visceral certainty, an instinct screaming from some place deep within. Sometimes, she would find her personal belongings slightly out of place, as if someone had touched them with care to avoid detection. Once, she found a single child's sock, Daisy's, in the pocket of a sweater she hadn't worn since before she fled. She had packed in haste, yes, but the sock hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. That moment broke her. She fell to the floor and sobbed, rocking herself, the sock clutched to her chest like a lifeline and a curse all at once. But the fear wasn't just about the present. As time passed, Sasha began to realize that the danger may not be rooted in the future, but buried in the past. There were pieces of her history that had never quite fit together, moments in her early adulthood she had written off as coincidence, strange occurrences she had dismissed in order to survive. But now, those fragments returned with alarming clarity. She remembered the man who had approached her years ago, asking questions about her family, claiming to know things he never should have known. She had laughed him off then, but his eyes, sharp, cold, amused, still haunted her. She had assumed he was just a scam artist, a drifter. But what if he hadn't been? What if the man Wiley saw, the man who now threatened them all, wasn't just an enemy of Michael, but someone who had followed Sasha long before Daisy was even born? The possibility that this threat was somehow tied to her own origins sent shivers down her spine. She began digging through old journals, revisiting conversations with her adoptive parents, looking for names, for details she had once overlooked. The more she searched, the less she trusted the narrative of her own life. What if she had never truly known who she was? What if Daisy's birth had triggered something, awakened something, that someone had been waiting for all along? And so, Sasha lived in limbo. Each sunrise was a reprieve, each sunset, a sentence. Her love for Daisy gave her strength, but it also made her vulnerable in ways she had never imagined. She didn't know when she would be able to return. She didn't know if it would ever be safe again. All she knew was that she would not wait forever. At some point, she would stop hiding. She would stop running. If the nightmare was hers to face, then she would face it. Because the thought of never holding her daughter again was far more terrifying than any monster that might be waiting in the dark. The sense of unease that once quietly loomed over the Quartermain estate had now transformed into a chilling certainty. Something was terribly wrong. It began with small, almost dismissible anomalies. The soft creak of a door in the middle of the night when everyone was asleep, the faint scuffle of footsteps along the hallway floors when no one was scheduled to be awake, and the flickering of hallway lights without any electrical cause. At first, Michael tried to rationalize them, drafts, faulty wiring, creaky old wood, but deep down, he knew better. Then the more tangible signs began. The security cameras, recently upgraded and constantly monitored, captured fleeting images of a dark figure moving just beyond the boundaries of the estate. Always just out of reach. A flash of a shoulder, the hem of a coat, a silhouette slipping behind a column. Then, nothing. As if the darkness itself swallowed the figure whole. Worse still, toys belonging to Daisy were discovered displaced in odd corners of the nursery, rearranged in ways that made Michael's blood run cold. A music box that had long been broken suddenly played again. A stuffed animal missing for days appeared sitting upright in the crib, staring at the ceiling. Michael responded the only way he knew how, with escalation. He doubled the number of guards on duty, installed biometric locks, and ensured that no one entered or left without authorization. Panic buttons were placed in every room, escape plans rehearsed, and silent alarms tested. Yet, for all his efforts, an invisible truth gnawed at him. If Daisy was the intended target, there was no such thing as impenetrable protection. Not from someone who knew how to dismantle fear and use it as a weapon. The name Wiley whispered, the man they believed either long dead or securely imprisoned, now echoed like a curse inside the walls of the estate. It was not just a name, it was a shadow stitched into the fabric of their lives. His return wasn't merely a threat. It was a shift in the very ground they stood on, a crack in the reality Michael had tried so desperately to restore. They were not simply defending their home, they were living in a waking nightmare. This wasn't a warning anymore. The figure watching them, moving unseen and untouched, had already made the first move. It wasn't a game of chess, it was an ambush disguised as suspense. Michael realized that this wasn't someone to be outwitted with strategy. This was someone who didn't play by rules, someone who thrived on the terror he sowed and fed off the unraveling of others. The illusion of control had been torn apart. Every ounce of security Michael layered over his family had become nothing more than a thin veil against an enemy who had already breached their defenses. He could feel it in the way the staff spoke in hushed voices, in the way Wiley clung to him longer each night, in the way Daisy would sometimes stare at the window with wide, unblinking eyes as if someone, was looking back at her. And it became increasingly clear, Sasha may have once been the primary target, a way to access Michael or settle old scores, but that had changed. Daisy, with her innocent laugh and piercing, crystalline eyes, was no longer collateral damage. She was the storm's center. The calm before the fury. Something about her, perhaps her lineage, perhaps something yet undiscovered, was drawing this darkness closer with an intensity that felt almost supernatural. Michael didn't yet understand why, but he knew the consequences of being unprepared. This wasn't just about protecting a child anymore, it was about confronting something that could unravel their entire lives. Everything Sasha had sacrificed, everything Michael had rebuilt, everything they both clung to, it could all vanish in an instant. And in that terrifying clarity, one truth reigned above all, the storm wasn't coming. It was already here.